Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the National Communication Association's discussion on communicating about climate. I'm Betsy Bach, and I'm delighted to be with you this evening. I'm a retired professor from Communication Studies here on the U of M campus, but am here more in my role as past president of the National Communication Association. And just for your information, this is part of a series of public programs that NCA has run throughout the country, the goal of which is to try to disseminate relevant information about communication studies to public audiences. And as I said, this is the second this year. A little bit about the National Communication Association. We're a 6,000 member academic association located in Washington, D.C., and it's our mission to advance communication as a discipline that studies all forms, modes, media, and consequences of human communication through humanistic and social, scientific, and aesthetic inquiry. Basically, we serve people who teach communication, so professors, elementary and secondary educators, and scholars and practitioners. NCA is the sponsor of the program this evening, but we would also like to thank very much the Department of Communication Studies and Climate Change Studies for their co-sponsorship. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce the people who will be on the panel this evening. And let me start first by introducing our moderator. To my immediate right is Lakeisha Anderson. And you can basically read information about them in the program. I'm just going to be oral interpreting that information for you. Lakeisha is the Director of Academic and Professional Affairs at NCA, again, the National Communication Association, and is a faculty member in the Johns Hopkins University's MA Communication program. She holds a PhD from George Mason University, where she did her research and continues to do research on health, risk, and crisis communication. And she has published that in several journals and books. Immediately prior to joining NCA, Lakeisha was assistant professor of communication at Indiana State University. And please join me in welcoming Lakeisha. Now let me introduce our panelists. We have, as Vicki Watson said, a very august group joining us this evening. And so I'm delighted to first introduce Amy Cilimburg, who is Executive Director of Climate Smart Missoula. And in that role, she advocates for climate solutions and works to build networks and community resiliency. She helped launch Climate Smart in 2015, following efforts to develop Missoula's municipal and community climate action plans. She's also worked on climate and energy policy and conservation for over a decade. She holds an MS degree in wildlife biology from U of M. She's also board chair of Missoula's Mountain Line Transit System, is on the board of the Missoula chapter of Montana Conservation Voters, and was recently appointed to the Governor's Climate Solutions Council. And please join me in welcoming Amy. Next is Matt Frank, who currently is serving as a fellow in regional journalism at the O'Connor Center for the Rocky Mountain West. He's a Missoula-based journalist and educator and is currently a fellow in regional journalism at the O'Connor Center. He edits, in his role there, Mountain West News. He also regularly teaches the Wild Rockies Field Institute course, Cycle the Rockies, Energy and Climate Change in Montana. Matt has also taught in the U of M School of Journalism's graduate program in environmental science and in natural resource journalism. And his work has won several regional and national awards, including a first place prize for beat reporting from the Society of Environmental Journalists. Once again, let's welcome Matt. Or not once again. Next is Peter McDonough, and he is coordinator of the Climate Change Studies program here at U of M. And he began teaching as an education volunteer with the Peace Corps in Tanzania, where he lived and taught high school for 3 years. Since returning home, he has worked primarily in climate change education, developing climate and energy classes for Stanford University Summer Institutes and for the U of M within environmental studies, climate change studies, and for the Global Leadership Initiative. He holds his BS in physics from the University of Puget Sound and an MS in civil and environmental engineering from Stanford, but a second MS in environmental studies from the University of Montana. Join me in welcoming Peter. Fourth is Nick Mott, who is producer of Threshold. Threshold is a podcast and radio show, for those of you unfamiliar with it. Season 2, entitled Cold Comfort, told the story of climate change in the Arctic through the eyes of the people who live there. The show was recognized with the National Edward R. Murrow Award. He's also worked as a reporter for Montana Public Radio, where his coverage has earned him accolades from the AP, the Associated Press. His work in audio, photography, and writing has appeared on NPR's Morning Edition, All Things Considered, Outside, PRI's The World, the Mountain West News Bureau, the Washington Post, Kaiser Health News, Alpinist, and many more. Nick is also producer at the MTPR podcast, Richest Hill. He holds an MA in environmental journalism from the University of Colorado at Boulder. Let's welcome Nick. Last but not least is Steve Schwarze, who is a professor in the Department of Communication Studies and director of the Climate Change Studies program here at U of M. His research focuses on rhetoric and public discourse, and he has a specific focus in environmental rhetoric. His work on rhetoric of environmental controversies has been published in our journal, Quarterly Journal of Speech, also Rhetoric in Public Affairs and Environmental Communication, and he is a 3-time recipient of NCA's Environmental Communication Division's Christine L. Oravak Award. Steve holds a BA from Drake University and a PhD from the University of Iowa. And join me in welcoming Steve. And now, Lakeisha, it's all yours.
Thank you, Betsy. All right, thank you all for joining us this evening. As Betsy mentioned, my name is Lakeisha Anderson, and I'll be moderating this evening. The way that we'll do this is there'll be about a 1-hour conversation with the panelists, and then we have about 30 minutes for Q&A at the end, at which time if you raise your hand, Caitlin in the back will be able to bring you a microphone and we can answer your questions. So we're going to go ahead and get started. We ready?
Yeah.
All right. Okay, one of the most powerful hurricanes ever recorded recently devastated the Bahamas and caused a lot of issues in both the United States and Canada. Many people have attributed an increase in severe weather to climate change, while others claim that this is fake news. How can we increase understanding about what's real and what's not real in issues of climate change?
Are we going to go down?
I think
Just go as you want.
popcorn style. Who would like to start?
First, is there anyone here who's confused about whether the hurricane is related to climate change? Anyone want to take a vote? Okay.
I think that means you're taking the
Oh, that
question.
means I have to
Place to
talk.
start.
Yeah.
Okay, that was my fault. Don't lean forward, I think is the moral. So the question of like how you, sorry, can you repeat the question? I had a thought.
I said, how can we increase understanding about what's real and what's not real with issues of climate change?
Okay. Yeah, I think this gets to one of the biggest issues with climate change in general, whether you're communicating it or teaching it or just working in it, is oversimplifying anything about it. And that can go for anyone on either side of the issue. So if you were the type of person who was going to raise your hand and say, no, the hurricane is not related to climate change, or yes, it's definitely related to climate change, there's always a danger of oversimplifying what that is. So anytime you see a hurricane and you shout climate change, you're kind of oversimplifying it. Anytime you see a hurricane, you shout not climate change, you're again oversimplifying it. So we have to first, as ourselves, accept that there's nuance. Climate change doesn't cause hurricanes, but it exacerbates their frequency and intensity and the damage they cause. But as people who are communicating, as people who are teaching or journalists or anyone, I think we have to trust our audience a little bit that they can handle that. That we don't have to break down climate change into yes, it's this, or no, it's not this. We can raise that. We can go up one more notch, I think, and trust that our audience can understand that there is more nuance to this than we might have otherwise spoken about.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point, and I think it also comes down. I mean, I think there's different levels of audience we're talking about addressing here, but understanding a difference between weather and climate, which is something super basic. But the same people who could say, no, this hurricane is not related to climate change, are some of the same people who could take a ball of snow into Congress and say, look, climate isn't changing, and that's because that's confusing. I mean, climate, scientists can fall for the same thing. They could say that, yes, this is climate change. This single storm is climate change. And that's, in a way, the same thing. But that's talking about a single storm and not a pattern. We're talking about a pattern over time. And that's, I really think, the important thing to convey and to understand.
I would add that one thing that's made this just more complicated and difficult is, of course, social media. And we can see, for example, with the recent fires in the Amazon, there were a lot of misleading stories coming out of the media saying that climate was the main driver behind those fires. And of course, it was much more nuanced, as Peter just said. And people were very quick to tweet and retweet about how climate change is driving these fires in the Amazon. And so some of it falls on consumers of media to, we can't all fact check every story we read, but we can, to a certain degree, sort of double check and make sure that we're not complicit in spreading stories that contain mistruths.
Maybe I think those are all really great points, and maybe a somewhat separate or different point here. I'm kind of assuming that people that are in this audience today care about climate change, or you wouldn't be here, and maybe unless Steve made you come or something because you're in his class. I don't know how that works exactly, but I think it definitely can cut both ways. We can oversimplify. We can just say climate change. I do this all the time. Climate change is the cause of all the problems that I see. My daughter breaks her wrist when she was 5 because it was hot and she slipped off a tree, and I'm like, climate change. If it wasn't that hot, she wouldn't have broke her wrist. And I'm joking, of course, but there's also, on the flip side of that, I think, we see some of these events, and I think the onus is on the people that care about climate and want to actually start developing or make better progress on solutions to bring up climate change in those contexts, and just say, have you read anything about the connection to an event and climate change, and what are the scientists saying? And try to draw out some conversations. And you might say, I don't know the answer to this one, but I'm going to find out and get back to you, or bring it up in the course of a conversation. Yeah, these floods are really dangerous. I wonder what the connection is. Have you been reading about that? And bring climate change into the conversation where it matters, as a point of talking about climate change. And we'll probably talk about this on the panel, but one of the biggest problems we have with solving climate change is that people don't talk about it. They may read about it or hear about it in the news, but they don't go talk to their neighbor or their friend about the fact that maybe it's happening, and maybe it's involved, and maybe there's nuance to the story. We're afraid to bring this topic up in polite dinner conversation or across the fence with your neighbors. So there's talking about it and doing it well, and there's also bringing up the conversation with people when it matters and when it fits, I guess.
To build on a couple of the points that my colleagues up here have mentioned, I think it's super important with respect to the social media question to sort of diversify your daily diet of information intake. So don't always rely on the same sources. Read across the political spectrum, read a variety of outlets, read across countries. Again, just in the same way that we don't necessarily have time to fact check every single article, we don't have time to read every single source, but the more that we can diverse our reading diet, our consumption diet of media, I think we're better off, and hopefully that can promote or spur you to be posing a question. I mean, I think of it as that, climate change in all of these conversations is the question, not necessarily the answer, right? So if we think about just sort of all manner of topics and issues, a question that we would want to ask about this is, to what extent may climate change be related to this? And those connections are complicated, tenuous, up for grabs, but raising them and seeing how climate change is linked to a lot of different areas, I think, can also help you understand the importance of climate change in your own life. And then the other question, I think, with respect to sources too, is the need to dig into sources, dig into what interests they may have, what financial backing they may have. Those are super important questions for understanding questions of bias, influence, motivation that may shape the messages that you're reading. And oftentimes that can be a difficult thing to do. It's certainly something that we try and teach in as many university courses as possible, is to do that hunting around, because that then can help you start to see patterns across certain advocates, across certain voices and sources, to understand then where those kinds of biases are coming from. And I think that can help you be a more critical consumer of messages about climate change.
I want to follow up on something that you mentioned about how it's not a conversation that we often have. It's not, climate change isn't often dinner conversation. If we find ourselves in situations where we want to bring it up and that's difficult to do, what ideas do you have for ways that we can do that?
I can start. Yeah, it's not always easy, and there's sometimes where it's simply not an appropriate part of the conversation, right? But there's a couple things that I tend to think about. How do I have a conversation where, and how do I bring it up in a way that we're all going to leave feeling maybe a little bit better about having talked about it, a little bit more inspired perhaps, maybe a little bit more daunted by what's ahead, but not shut down. And I think some of what I do, and also what I've read in some of the social science things that you do, you want to make an inroad with somebody, talk about what it is that's happening here in our world and something that we can relate to. So, you're up on the chairlift hanging up to Snowball, and everything's melting out and it's only February. You might say, gosh, I wonder, how's your ski season going? Do you get out of Montana? Because Montana skiing's not very good right now. And I wonder, how might climate change be a factor of that? And step into the conversation by asking what they're interested in. And again, it depends on how much you know this person. If this is a stranger, perhaps, you want to connect and have a bond with that person, so that you have some shared interests and values and understand what their values are. Maybe they actually hate skiing and they have no interest in being up at Snowball, and they'd really love it if it all melted out so they could start growing their tomatoes and have tomatoes in Montana because the growing season's longer. You could at least talk to them about what matters, and you could start digging into how climate change may be a part of their values in their world. So I think a lot of the social scientists that I've read that talk about it, you make a bond, you make a connection, and then usually when it's climate change, because it's so big, there's one way that you might want to, dig into the issue and then the solution. Maybe it's about the environment, and you want to think about what solutions might stem from that in terms of what people could actually do to help solve the problem, whether that's actual, getting at the root of the problem, mitigation, reducing the carbon footprint, whether it's maybe the different things we do to adapt to the problem. So you make that connection, and then you can talk about some of the solutions, and you can just listen. Sometimes the first time you have a conversation with somebody, you want to bring up climate change. Maybe that's not the time that you start talking about tax policy and whether there should be cap and trade or tax and dividend and get into the weeds. Maybe you think that you're going to have follow-up time with that person, and you can slowly build that relationship and start talking more specifics. We all know know, I mean, we're social creatures. We know how to gauge those conversations. And it generally doesn't go well if you just, you jump too far. Or if you don't bring it up at all, then you have no way to build on that story and start to have some shared understanding.
We must be reading the same stuff, Amy, because you took all my points, doggone it. And I especially want to underscore her last point about listening. I mean, my usual shtick on this, my usual line at panels like this is to say that one of the best ways to talk about climate change is to not talk about climate change, is to listen to other people and find out what are the things that matter to them, what are their desires, what are their fears, what are the things that they want for themselves and for their kids and for their family. And in doing that listening, then you start to develop that bond, right? You're establishing that common ground, which is a fundamental principle of any communication class for sure. So finding out those things, right, is, I mean, it's important relationally, right? But you're also gathering information that then provides inroads, possibilities for you to connect climate to those things that matter to them.
Yeah, I mean, you've both stolen my points as well, I think. But to go just a little bit beyond this, I think it's fundamentally important, and this goes beyond climate change. It's not just a matter of, listening and empathizing to talk about climate change. It's just something we're lacking across our society, is genuine connection and talking to those we don't know so well, and getting a little bit out of our comfort zone or out of our cell phones, and really getting to know others and engaging and deeply listening. And that can help address climate change, and that can help address all kinds of human connection.
Just to build on that, unless you wanted to go, Matt.
No, go ahead.
Kind of back to the core issue of just asking questions. Even if you do get beyond that initial asking questions, you actually do end up talking about climate change. Like those words just pop out of someone's mouth accidentally, and suddenly you're there, and it's awkward. And you just got to do it. Is that just me? Okay. That questioning can still help. Like we want to grab people by the lapels. We want to ask them why they don't get it. We want to shout because it's infuriating, right? But that continued question, even if it's about climate change, even if it's about their own experience, their own views, it can be incredibly powerful. And I'm going to pick on a student right now, because that's my prerogative as a teacher. And he may or may not be sitting right in front of me. I'm not making eye contact. But he did a class project a couple years ago where he called home to a parent. I got this right? Sorry, I wasn't supposed to point at him. To a parent that was not up on climate change, didn't agree that it was an issue or that it was a priority, and just had this long conversation and recorded it and made a podcast out of it and posted it to the climate change website. And it was just this beautiful series of questions, just one after the other from a father to a son, or from a son to a father. And it was like the amount of progress he made in that simple conversation, even if your dad didn't change his mind in the end. But just that kind of mutual understanding was impressive to hear in this brief podcast. So just that asking questions without having to insert yourself, without having to make it about you, can be incredibly powerful. Sorry, Matt.
He did change his mind
a year down the road. He changed his mind a year down the road. Okay. Success.
Increasingly, we can root these conversations about climate change in economics. And I find myself doing that quite a bit. Coal has been killed by natural gas. It's cheap natural gas and fracking. It's not environmental regulations. Maybe 5% of it has been, but by and large, it's been cheap natural gas. And coal is simply being outcompeted. Just yesterday, there's a coal mining company that is about to pay $90 million to get rid of 2 massive open pit coal mines in Wyoming. They have to pay to get rid of these mines because the liabilities, the environmental cleanup liabilities are so huge. And so we have basic economic truths right now that are trending in the right direction in terms of clean energy. Wind turbine technician is the fastest growing job in the country, according to federal data. Solar installers, I don't have any numbers on that, but I mean, it's just skyrocketing. So there are a lot of economic things that If you're not talking about climate change specifically, you can talk about these economic trends and truths that demonstrate this energy transition underway, regardless of how you feel about climate change.
And I would just build on that. I mean, in terms of sort of thinking about, lines of argument or appeals that may reach across certain kinds of divides. It's, partly it's about kind of finding messages and finding the right inroads, but oftentimes it's also about finding the right speakers, finding the right messengers. And for certain kinds of audiences, right, you may not be the most credible or the most persuasive or the most compelling messenger, right? There are other kinds of messengers who may be more important. And when you can, again, staple of public speaking is that if you don't have the credibility as a speaker, you enlist through sources other people who are credible to your audience. So if you're speaking to someone that perhaps has a strong military background, you trot out Jim Mattis, right? You trot out defense officials who are clearly understand that climate change is real and the military needs to figure out how they're going to deal with that, right? They may be more persuasive than an environmental advocate or a woolly-headed liberal. Those are the kinds of messengers that you can channel to help make some connections across political and cultural divides.
Can I ask a follow-up? Oh, Amy, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to, when you do look into that, health professionals, they win in the who's the best messenger because people care about their health of themselves, their parents, their kids. And so we have a lot of health concerns with climate change. One of the things I try to do is shift when, I hear on NPR, well, the environmentalists say that we should do X, Y, or Z on climate change. It's like, but it's not even an environmental issue. It's so much bigger. So why don't we call up the health professionals and see what they say about this issue? And in Missoula, Montana is very significant to us with wildfire smoke and heat and some of the things that we are facing today. So anyway, I totally agree. It's the messengers, and those messengers can be diverse, and they can be people that you know. They can be your mom or your sister, yourself, as who's a nurse. I mean, those we don't have to go all the way to Jim Mattis, although that'd be great, but he doesn't live here, so sometimes you have to. but yeah, so figuring out what is that issue and what are those values, and then who speaks well to those. If you can bring those people in or speak, share what those people have shared with you can be really helpful.
Yeah. And just to expand on that just the tiniest bit, I think one thing we're getting at, without explicitly saying, is just grounding. As we're talking, grounding these things in our shared lived experience. So, observing the snow at Snow Bowl, talking about the tangible public health and health impacts in our communities, grounding what we're talking about in things we both know and both experience and both see every day.
Okay, so just to follow up, all of you have mentioned something that I want to follow up on, so this might be a longer question. But when we're talking about the credibility of disseminators of information, I wonder if you can talk to me more about the actual message itself. Do you find it's more helpful to be persuasive, to present infographics, statistics, to make emotional appeals, like fear appeals that have to do with climate change, and then how we take something that is very abstract to a lot of people and isn't noticeable, immediate outcomes aren't very noticeable sometimes, and how we get people engaged in those conversations? So what's a strong message look like, and then how do we get people engaged with something they don't immediately see maybe an impact with?
My answer to this is pretty similar to the last one. I think, one, you have to start by reading the room, read your audience, figure out what message you need to convey and how to get through to that. To give an example, I guess, I was recently reporting in Kansas, which is where I'm from, and I was in a community called Greensburg, which is a community that made the news a bunch about 10 years ago. This tornado just totally destroyed the town, like 95% of homes, and it is a very, very conservative town in a very, very conservative state, but they rebuilt green partially for branding. They were Greensburg and could be green, but also, for some very meaningful reasons. And I was there 10 years later talking about what's worked, what hasn't, and why it happened, and how things have changed since. But one thing I noticed was that people weren't as eager to talk about climate, but they were very eager to talk about the environment. They were very eager to talk about leaving things better than they found it. And I was really learning from them how they engaged with the world around them. So I think, the first step is learning from the person you're talking to with how they perceive the world.
Yeah, go ahead, Steve.
My favorite example to trot out on this is it's not really a message, it's more of an embodied action. About, 6 or 7 years ago, a bunch of Canadian scientists came up with this thing called Rink Watch. Anybody ever heard of a Rink Watch? All right, awesome. There's going to be teaching at least for the 50 folks that are here. Rink Watch is citizen science. We all know what citizen science is, right? It's you going out and counting the knapweed on Mount Sentinel, or it's you going out and measuring stuff, gathering data about something that then scientists can use to help track trends. So Rink Watch, as you might imagine, is super cool in Canada because what do? They gather information about winter weather conditions, about the freezing and melting of their outdoor skating rinks. And so they had, I think, 1,400 or so communities in Canada that do this as a way that people can start to connect with the ways in which climate change has an impact on their lives. And then also, right, start to become more engaged with what the scientific process is all about and how people do science on climate change and what that means and what that looks like. So to me, that's an example of not kind of sort of a straightforward message. I've got my 10-minute speech and here are the 5 appeals or arguments you should make. But instead, it's an embodied experience, it's participatory, and it connects with something that is a staple of Canadian life. It depoliticizes the issue, right? It gives people a different perspective to look on it. And so I just think that for me, that has been always a great example of thinking about how you can make climate change a real thing in the here and now and help people to integrate it in their own lives rather than making it this kind of forced discussion or a didactic, I'm going to tell you all of these things. So that's my cool example.
And we've all heard people speak about climate change in very fatalistic terms. It's really, I would imagine most of us spend some portion of some nights up stewing about climate change. Is that true, team? It's a hard issue, right? But I've also tried to figure out as an advocate or somebody that's, trying to get people to do something about it. That's my job. I've been doing that for a decade or so. I have noticed, and then also the social science supports this, that if you're too fatalistic about it and just throw people out with the really, some of it is the truth, but without any sort of discussion about the nuance, about what we heard today, about our ability to actually change the trajectory that we're headed towards, people just shut down. I'm more concerned about people who have a fatalistic view of climate change than those who just deny it. The deniers can learn, but people who are fatalistic are just giving up, and those are the people we need to be at the rallies and on the streets and calling their representatives or running for office and all those things. So there's, and this is probably, sort of Captain Obvious here, but if we talk about the seriousness of the issue, we have to be kind of constructive with our seriousness, but also constructive with our solutions and give people ideas about what they can do. And again, you don't want to just be, we can fix this tomorrow by, some technological miracle or something. But when I do talk to people and we start talking about the seriousness of it, it's really important to figure out what it is. And again, it can be listening, it can be offering ideas, but what it is that people can do to help chart a different course. It's weird that as climate change is sort of bearing down on us more significantly and the science gets more grim, it's almost easier to have these conversations because people are starting to feel, unless they've tipped over the edge and they just can't deal, they're totally on that fatalistic side. People want to do more, and I think there's a lot of opportunity to build off of what we know. So there's that balance of hope and despair, and both are needed. I think, in a lot of the conversations. And again, that depends on who you're talking to and where they're engaged in the conversation.
I'll stick with the theme, which, if you've been following the trend, is maybe don't use scare tactics. It doesn't seem to work most of the time.
It doesn't seem to work.
And as Nick said, like, read a room. I think any of the answers to any of these questions is going to probably start with read a room, like know who you're talking to. You might be talking to a climate denier, and then it's a very different conversation. Then you need to figure out why they deny climate change. If it's because it's like they don't want to have to deal with it, you might not be able to get through to them. If it's more that they're just not aware, or they're just annoyed that all these liberals are getting angry and getting loud, you might ask them, okay, why do you think they're getting angry and loud? Like, what do you think they're feeling right now? And see if you can just kind of worm your way in that way. But I think another really important piece, and this comes up a lot when we talk about climate change, especially with students, is that addressing climate change is a grieving process. I think many of you have probably heard that before. And so you need to know where in the process your audience is. So if anyone's been following Greta Thunberg's visit to the United States, her message is, I want you to panic. I don't want your respect, I don't want your accolades, I want you to panic. Because to her eyes, the United States as a country has not yet panicked. And we need to in order to realize the reality. But if someone's already panicked, which I think most of the people in this room have probably already gone through that stage, and you've moved on to action and activism and, doing things in your own life about climate change, then you don't want to re-panic those people by scaring the bejesus out of them and reminding them that the world's going to hell in a handbasket. So you need to focus on what Amy was saying, like, what can you do? Where are we? What are we actually doing? So that's where scared tactics actually can be the most harmful, is taking people who could be really productive and driving them back into depression and back into sleepless nights.
I want to just quickly look at this through a journalistic lens for a second and mention a study by the Schwarze Center conducted last year, and they looked at coverage of climate impacts in Shishmaref, Alaska, and they basically found that all of these reporters who were kind of parachuting in and taking pictures of these houses sort of falling off cliffs into the ocean and talk about these communities being moved because of sea level rise and whatnot. All of that fostered a sense of powerlessness among readers. And so the point of this study was, how can we be more creative? How can we personalize our reporting on these issues and counter that sense of powerlessness in our reporting? And will have to defer to Nick, because as part of the Threshold podcast, they went to Shishmaref and reported and did exactly that. They focused on the people and the resiliency and adaptation. And I think those are really important elements for storytelling when it comes to climate change.
Yeah, I'll add, well, thank you, first of all, and I'll add just a little more to that. I'm glad, it makes me super happy that you weren't referring to us when referring to that sense of hopelessness. When people read or see things about Shishmaref. So for those of you who don't know, Shishmaref is a small community of about 600 on Barrier Island on the Bering Strait, and there's less and less sea ice every fall, leading to more intense winter storms that are basically just pummeling the island that used to be protected by sea ice. And homes are falling to the sea. The town has voted twice to relocate, can't get the funds to do so, and so they're there. And there's slowly more and more island getting eaten away. But the story of Shishmaref isn't just a story of climate change; it's also a story of colonization, and it's a story of the people who live there who are not resigned to hopelessness. And that's, I think, something we need to keep coming back to as climate communicators all around, and just as people. I think talking about hope, talking about optimism and fatalism is super important. And so is talking about vulnerability and being vulnerable about our own uncertainties, about our own actions in relation to climate and climate change.
Okay, I don't know if this is stirring the pot, but I'm going to try. So the other piece of Greta's message, right, is the one thing that we need more than hope is action, right? What I think is great about, one thing I think is great about Greta Thunberg's message, right, is that she's trying to show how our thinking is often backwards on some of this stuff, right? So it's not like we got to rev people's hope up in order that they act. It's let's get people acting, Okay? And by acting, we become more hopeful, right? We start to see the possibilities of our own power, our own agency, our own ability to do stuff in concert with others. And then our hopefulness grows as a byproduct of our acting. So you don't necessarily have to agree with it. That's what the Q&A is for. Okay, but I think what I think is productive and provocative about her message is that she gives us a different way of sequencing these kinds of things. If any of you have seen the movie, the documentary No Impact Man, follows a family in New York for a year where they try to have no ecological impact and try to reduce that as much as they can. I think that's one of the implicit messages of that film as well. Like, you don't have to persuade and get people to completely buy into your point of view before they can start doing stuff, right? Start the doing stuff now and see how it feels. See how cool and fun it is to connect with others and work together in concert to accomplish something. That suggests another thing about the whole idea of hope is that it is easy to fall into the late night despair, right? When there I am scrolling through, typing around, reading the latest terrible news, right? But when I'm in concert with others, right? When I go to campus and start talking with other people and interacting with my family or whatever it might be, then things start to perk up for me. I don't have that sense of despair and hopelessness nearly as much as when I am engaged with others who have similar commitments and concerns and are willing to work together with me. The other point I would want to make on this is, in addition to Greta's message, there's also the message from David Wallace Wells, who wrote a book called The Uninhabitable Earth. It's been little short versions of it all over the internet in the past year. He's an alarmist. Right? I mean, he's somebody who starts his book by saying, it is worse, much worse than you think. Right? I mean, it's a good first line for a book. And he goes through it, but at the same time, right, he says, but I am an optimist. And the reason that he is an optimist is because climate change is a result of human action. And therefore, everything that we can do to act and minimize climate change and reduce climate change is a step in the right direction. So ultimately, at some level, climate change is always in our hands. And so that is, I think, to me, is an important way of thinking about this. How it's important to have to go into this situation with both eyes open, okay? But also to realize that ultimately our fate is in our hands, and so we just need to start acting more quickly, more urgently to be able to address the problem.
I want to follow up because when you're talking about Greta, you're talking about a specific a voice, a youth voice, and I'm wondering if anybody on the panel can talk to me more about how, the value of events like the global climate strike and the value of youth voices in motivating behavior change around climate change.
I think we'll find out tomorrow around the world. I mean, I think what's really exciting right now is the youth voice, not just that they're youth around the world. I mean, I guess that's one of the pieces is that it's youth voices. Another is that it's around the world, so people feel connected to people around the world. And this isn't entirely new. I mean, 350 did some really neat global movements, maybe a little less youth-focused, but still actually a lot of youth folks stepping up. So between this and then Sunrise Movement and some of these new things over the course of the years, they do galvanize people to get inspired. I think what's going to be interesting is there's been a lot of youth activities and movements and even global ones, and you'll pick up the newspaper the next day or you'll look on the news and they'll be barely mentioned, not even in the paper. Nothing about this just event that was global and hit every single country but North Korea as far as anybody knows. And what's really, I think, hopeful right now is that's not going to be the news Friday, Saturday, and Sunday this week. People are really awake to this, and they're giving youth, this extra. They're giving youth the voice that they deserve. So that's going to be an interesting, just because we're talking about communication and how it's covered in the journalistic piece of it, I think it'll be interesting to see that. There's a lot of evidence that people do. I think one of the studies I read that parents change their mind and act on climate change if their teen girls start talking to them about it. And there was something a difference between boys and girls in this particular study, but they have a really a great voice. And clearly, the message that's resounding with people is the message that says, hey, we're going to be alive in 2050 and you're going to be dead. That's sort of what we have to think about. As when they talk to especially older elected officials and people in power that are clearly not going to be alive and not giving this the attention. So they come from that youth voice, whether it's 8 or 10 or 20, the fact that we're giving the young people a world that's really going to be a difficult world to navigate through is what seems to be catching people's attention.
Yeah, I think the sheer magnitude of what's happening is amazing, and
Yeah.
I'm excited to see what happens tomorrow. In the spirit of stirring the pot a little bit more, and relating back to your question, I'm curious about all of us, and I don't want to answer this question at all, but are you optimistic or not, or should we even be talking about that? Are these questions? What role does personally hope have? And I don't want to answer. I will if I have to, but let's start.
He was pointing right at you.
Yeah, I'm sort of beyond it. Maybe it's because I don't have a great answer for it. I always sort of debate whether I'm going to play this card, but I'm going to do it. I'm personally in a situation where, in my life, I'm facing a difficult challenge because I have a metastatic cancer diagnosis, and so my clock's ticking faster than the average person, and there's all kinds of reasons to despair, and crawl into a shell. And I see lots of friends that do that, and it's an understandable response, but at the same time, I don't have a choice but to forge ahead and try and do something about my situation and live the best possible life that I can, and do as much as I possibly can to stretch out my timeline and slow it down as much as possible. So that's something that for me personally has helped me. It gives me other ways of thinking about this. It's I don't have time to putz around with feeling should I be hopeful about my personal situation. It's I got to jump right in and do what I can to make this work. That's not certainly anything that I would wish upon anyone, or a mindset that it's a mindset that I hope you all have. That's what let me put it that way. Sometimes you just have to dig in spite of the difficulties that are in front of you, and that's kind of where. That's where I'm at on that. But with respect to the youth issue too, what is interesting to me about the rise of youth voices in the climate movement is their intersection with the notion of climate justice and environmental justice that has been boiling for many years. And I think one reason why youth are attracted to the climate justice movement is because climate justice and environmental justice are fundamentally rooted in the idea that the people who are most impacted and who are facing the most severe harms are the folks who have the least power and least influence to address the problem. And so if you're a high school student who can't vote, who's getting ignored, right, who doesn't have a platform, who doesn't have access or standing to be able to participate in arenas of decision making, right, they're looking for something else. But they now have a language in climate justice movement that helps to explain their position and starts to open a space for them to say, hey, my voice matters too, and I need to say something. And this message has been loud and clear in the organizing in Missoula with respect to the climate rally that's taking place tomorrow. It's Friday is going to be a day when student voices are front and center. We appreciate the help from environmental groups and adults in the community, but this is our time. And I'm totally cool with that, right? That's important. And so I think as far as that sort of merger, I think I'm very hopeful that kind of activity and that kind of message will continue to circulate as a result of this climate strike.
Hearing Steve talks hearing Steve talk makes me think of an essay I read last night, and I'm not going to do this justice. It was by a climate scientist whose last name is Marvel. I want to say Kate Marvel.
Kate Marvel, yeah, she's
Marvel.
awesome.
And she wrote a piece last year for On Being. And I really recommend that you Google it, On Being, Kate Marvel. And it was about hope and courage. And she made a case for courage. And, I think Steve, what you just said, and Steve himself embodies that. So I'm not going to try to explain her words, but I encourage you to go check it out. It was really fantastic.
I think it's worth noting that what we're describing, what the youth are doing in this movement, is the hardest thing that we do, to put yourself out there when you have no power to risk, just to risk generally, whether you're risking a job, risking education, risking respect. That's the hardest thing that we do. And it's when we do it well, we are at our best. And so what's cool about the youth doing this is that they are reminding us adults, quote unquote, what we are at our best. And, Steve was saying earlier about just being part of a community that is acting, just being active with other people doing things. It's a very well-researched thing that when you are active with other people, you kind of become greater than the sum of your parts, and that's very true with climate change. So the youth movement is building on that, but also they are a reminder of what it looks like to risk and to be at your best at the same time.
Talking about youth as kind of a marginalized voice, one that we don't often hear about, I'm wondering if you can talk to me more about other marginalized voices, like the voices of indigenous groups or people of color in the climate change conversation.
To build again on Steve's points here, I think one of the things that does give me hope, and that is one of the most promising things for the future, is seeing the room for growth at the intersection of climate change and social justice. And I think in all, as communicators, as a journalist, I seek to highlight the voices of indigenous people, people of color, those who we don't otherwise hear. I'm a white dude. There are a lot of white dudes at this table. It'd be great if this table didn't look like the way it does, and that's not to fault anybody here or the organizers of this event in any way. But this is an important way of demonstrating that we're all in this together, and that those, but climate change makes social problems worse. Efforts to combat climate change make them slightly better, at least. They're all inextricably connected. And this is, I think, a real way forward in terms of climate activism and making differences, forging alliances, finding intersections, and really building coalitions.
There was a sign. Do you all remember the 2017 Women's March? It's hard to forget that one. Very cold day in Helena. There was a sign in the DC March. It was, I think it was a young woman standing on the side. A sign that said, "I'll see all you nice white ladies at the Black Lives Matter rally," right? Which I thought was a brilliant sign. And I think if we want to call ourselves the climate movement in this room, if we want other people to show up for the climate movement, we have to show up for them, and recognize what Nick is saying, that these, social justice, wealth inequality, even gun violence, all kinds of things, healthcare, public education, climate change, they're all related. And it's hard to ask you to fight every fight. There's only so many hours in the day and you have only so many calories in your body to use. But we can't ignore them and then fight our own fight and expect them to just be there. So we got to show up for them too. Speaking as a white male, that's my opinion.
And I think to build off of that, the climate movement isn't all about rallies and isn't all about who speaks and who's there at places. I think those events can help introduce you to people. I think the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and movement here in Montana has really has brought forth a lot of people who, it's not their issue, but yeah, I'm going to do exactly what Peter has just suggested. And then people start to meet and get to know each other and find that there's also interest in, everything from climate change to Standing Rock to different issues. And so there's a lot of connections. And I think what I've seen happen even in Missoula then is as these social justice issues intersect with climate change, they're really intersecting to some degree as we think about climate adaptation. How are we dealing with the climate change that's here or coming, not just how we stop it. And there's a whole planning effort that's going on right now, and there's a lot of different voices there, and it's a lot about health and different people that aren't the climate activists and maybe won't even be at the rally tomorrow, but are thinking about the fact that they work with a population that has a low-income population that has a lot of asthma, a lot of respiratory issues, and wildfire smoke is really tough. So how are they part of this? So I do think that it's really important that as we do those planning efforts or we consider policy at the local, state, and federal level, we're thinking about it from that way. And it's maybe more obvious in the adaptation world, but then they intersect as you figure out both of those pieces.
Can I do a pot stirring? He stirred it first, so I'm just going to keep that random. You can agree with this or disagree with this. Take all the social justice movements that are happening, all the things that we want to include in the climate movement. If we had a socially just society and a socially aware economy in the 1980s, we would have solved climate change. We would not be here today. I'm just positing that. I'm throwing it out to you to mull over. Students, we'll talk about it tomorrow. Oh yeah, I should have thrown that at the panelists. What do you think, panelists?
Well, I mean, it's something that's reflective of a statement by an African-American woman in Flint who said at one of the meetings around Flint that we don't just have a water problem, we have a democracy problem. And I think that what Peter is saying, I think lends credence and context to that idea, to the extent that when you have a more democratic society, more broad participation in discussion of important public issues, then you can deal with these other kinds of problems in a better and a more just way. And so, having a seat at the table is part of it. And I think that stepping aside, right? I mean, I'm up here today, but I've tried to, in other events that we're trying to put on, I'm trying to sort of step aside, give other people the microphone, make sure there's representation from as many groups and interests as possible. And then to come back to this idea of climate change being the question and the whole, we'll see with the Black Lives Matter rally, right? I mean, there's so many other, I think one of the things we've heard so far is that there's so many other intersecting issues that dovetail with climate change that it brings back this question, how is climate change the question that is relevant to maybe the issue that matters to you, or the issue that matters to the person next to you, or the person whose voice you may not have heard, right? How is climate change the question that might help to bridge or build those conversations to see that you have some common cause in some important issue?
Okay, I think we have just enough time for a couple of questions, and I'm going to try and get both of them if possible. But I think it's hard to have a conversation like this without discussing the impact of politics on the communication around climate change. So I'm wondering if you can tell me a little bit about, with the presidential election coming up, how the media impact on conversations about climate change is influenced and how that matters.
The media?
The media. Mm-hmm. I know this is also a coal state, so I know that that's a big issue. I'm from a coal region myself, so I know that that's a huge part of the rhetoric there. So if you can talk to me a little about that, that'd be great.
I'll just quickly mention one really cool thing that's happened recently. The Columbia Journalism Review and The Nation teamed up to start this thing called Covering Climate Now, and it's spread like wildfire all over the world. different news organizations committing to covering climate change more and better. And there's like a very intense week right now of coverage leading up to the Climate Action Summit. So an interesting, parallel between journalism recognizing the importance of more coverage and the kids movement and the school strikes. I think it's really making an impact, and it really hit home to me today when I saw the cover of The Economist, the newest edition of The Economist. The cover is, are you guys familiar with Ed Hawkins, the climate scientist who does these very simple climate images? It's like stripes, just really, really powerful. Couldn't be more simple image, but it's just stripes, blue and red stripes that span X number of years, probably over a century. And they go, from blue and light blue to blue, and then slowly to pink and to red, representing the warming of the globe. And the Economist, in the cover story that I read today, basically came out and said that that capitalism needs to be questioned. It's like, wow, like that, like The Economist. I think it's one of the best publications in the world, and they're coming out. They use the word gelding in talking about about capitalism. So there's, in terms of the media generally, there is a shift underway, and I hope you mentioned how things aren't covered often, like in the aftermath of big events, and I hope that's changing. I think it's going to change, at least among these organizations that have committed to this Covering Climate Now movement.
Yeah. Threshold's part of Covering Climate Now, and it definitely seems like a really interesting initiative. One thing I do want to point out too is that the media isn't just one thing. The media doesn't have just one message and portray anything in just one way. The media is the best and the worst and the mediocrest of climate writing that there is. It's a million different things, and what you consume right now is the way we consume things is pretty screwed up, because we all have our own little bubbles of different consumption that some people have great consumption habits, seek out different articles from different sources. So to answer how the media shapes climate communication and what we know about climate and the messaging around climate, I think is a tricky question to answer, because it depends on what media you're consuming. And to get at that, to really answer, media some media has some wonderful climate messages and some really insightful things, but I think this is part of a bigger question about media literacy and finding, how to promote or how to get people towards the best sources. And also in terms of Covering Climate Now, I think it's a great initiative, but one other sort of pot-stirry question I want to pose, mostly rhetorically, is, as we keep seeing all this climate coverage, catastrophe after catastrophe, and a lot of media coverage is just all this bad shit is happening, how do we keep from getting climate fatigue? How do we keep, engaged with this without just saying, yeah, we know the world is screwed? I don't think so. I don't think the world is screwed.
Yeah, I mean, just 2 small points to that. The media is all what we consume, but we also participate in that. We buy our local paper, or we write letters to the editor. I mean, believe it or not, people still read letters to the editor and the Missoulian, the Missoula Current, other local source people. You can comment back to. I mean, I've written NPR back when I was a little bummed that they kept talking about how the environmentalists responded. I was like, so anyway, the media is a two-way street. We share media for sure on our social media. Oh, did you read this paper or something like that? But I think we can put it forward more obviously to sometimes. And you mentioned, given the presidential year and how the media is covering it, we have to push back. I mean, we in this state give some of our elected officials a pass on climate change, and why do our editorial boards of our papers allow that? Do they believe in climate change or not? And what are they going to do about it? These are the questions we need to encourage our media to ask as we're moving into not just a presidential election season, but just an election season. And I think that's something that we all need to demand of our media, is that they're asking better questions and they're not letting people get away with not answering the question. There's too much pivot, go on, talk about something else. that happens at the debates or whatever, and we need to push back. I don't know how. Maybe you guys are experts at, but it's hard.
Well, I mean, a couple points, one short and one rant. If you're following me on Facebook, you know it's my favorite mode of discourse is the rant, the diatribe. I mean, one is well, I mean, maybe 3 points. I mean, one is I think it was a great leap forward having the climate forum, the CNN thing, right? I mean, if we're going to talk about extended discourse, if we're going to talk about not just sound bites, if we're going to talk about depth, that even if it wasn't perfect, it was a hell of a lot better.
This is the presidential.
Yeah. So I mean, I'm trying to just go like basic politics here. Second thing is like an important question to ask when lots of I mean, I agree that the media is not one thing. I preach this to my students all the time. The media is not one thing. The internet is not one thing. Social media can work for ill and good. But in a lot of, in terms of dominant narratives in the mainstream media, right, there's a lot of focus on the costs of all the climate proposals that the Democratic candidates are trotting out, right? It's an important question. It has to be asked. The question that also needs to be asked is, what are the costs of inaction? What are the costs of continuing with business as usual and not taking significant action on climate change? And how do we weigh that? I mean, that's an important question that we want to keep pressing on, keep pressing journalists to cover. The other thing is, in New York Times is starting to drive me crazy. I mean, they publish these crazy editorials about Greta Thunberg that I think are completely dismissive, and they should be ashamed of publishing some of that stuff. There's also a dominant media narrative about the Green New Deal and about whether climate change as an issue is pulling the Democratic Party to the left. Okay? A perfect example of this is in late summer, the Times did one of these like 8 to 10 minute video things. It was basically right around that issue itself. Like here's all the candidates' positions. Oh, they're going too far to the left by pushing this Green New Deal stuff. Yada yada yada. Right? Dominant narrative. Right? I mean, I think many of you have seen or heard this. Right? About the same time, there's an extended Tom Edsall column. Right? He's a long-time political reporter. He looked at the kind of the latest public opinion data on among Democrats and wrote this piece about the three faces of the Democratic Party. Right there, you got and you all know who they are, right? There's your progressives over here, and then there's your liberals over here, and then there's your conservative Democrats and independence-leaning Democrat. And so he uses this data to weave this standard boring narrative about. Not anything really about climate change, but like there's this internal dissension in the Democratic Party. That is true, right? I'm not saying he's telling a false story, right? And it's something that needs to be understood. But the data bear this out. But what he didn't look at, was the opposite kind of story. Rather than looking at what is driving these folks apart, what might in fact bring them together? Where are their points of connection and unity? So guess what are the two data points that are the most important? What are the two issues that are the most important for conservative and independent-leaning Democrat voters? Number one, creating new jobs. Number two, reducing climate change. Now, if that is not the Green New Deal in a nutshell, I don't know what is. And so an entirely different narrative could have been told by someone willing to think carefully and more critically about that data. That in fact, a climate-forward policy would pull Democrats to the center and not be tacking to the left. So the dominant narratives, right, oftentimes start to perpetuate themselves in unproductive ways that make it more difficult for readers and consumers to think differently about politics. Right? They make it easy to put climate-friendly policies in a certain kind of box and continue to pack the same label on them. Regardless of what you think about the Green New Deal or whether you plan to vote Democrat or Republican, that's not my point. My point is that the media narratives can oftentimes shape our understanding in ways that are not particularly creative or productive for interesting thinking about how we deal with climate change as a political issue. rant over.
Pete, if you have something you want to add real quick, that's great, and I'm going to let you do that. But after that, we're going to wrap up and go to Q&A.
Oh, wow. I have
go
to
ahead.
follow a diatribe and make it quick.
Just agree.
You guys are great. This is the best panel. Kind of to build on what everyone's been saying, the big red flag for me when I encounter climate change media is, do they make it political or not? Is this a political argument or not? Like, there are certain aspects of climate action that have political elements to it, and certainly politicians have their own thing that you have to pay attention to. A good illustration of this, and I'm simplifying this dramatically, but both Missoula County Public Schools, MCPS, and the University of Montana in the past week put out emails or big communications about the climate strike. Did anyone read either of those, either from the provost's office or from MCPS? Really, very few, okay. Oh, I'm just getting like nods. This is like teaching classes again. You guys are adults, raise your hands. When Missoula County Public Schools put out the communication, they said, we support the strikes. Teachers, please allow your students to be involved. Here's the protocols for doing this. Teachers may not leave school to strike because teachers, by contract, are not allowed to use school time to take political action. University of Montana put out a communication saying, basically, teachers do whatever the hell you want. The underlying message is that even though University of Montana professors are held to the same type of contract that you may not use university time for political action, climate change is not a political issue. It just is an issue. It is a science. It is a reality. Do what you have to do. Very different communications, both in support of the strike, both from good people and good institutions who want to do right by their students. But just that slight difference of, is this political or not political? And you could probably trace that back to where these two institutions focus their attention. What media they're consuming, what kind of framing they're getting from the people they read or listen to. So it's always a huge red flag for me. It gets me a little bit bitter when I see a really good publication come out with a headline that's just climate change political nonsense. But like Nick was saying, you got the best and the worst and the in-between. So if you're keeping your ear to the ground, and is anyone here like a scroll the headlines kind of person? I'm gonna make you raise your hands this time. You're like, yeah, you go to Facebook, you go to the phone, you like scroll, you get kind of the full thing. Anyone here, like, you pick one article, you read it for forever, and then you're good? Okay, hopefully some mix of these things, maybe like a T-shaped news thing. But keep your ear to the ground, scroll the headlines. You'll get a good feel for what's going on anyway, and then pick out the ones that sound right to you and go in depth with them. But even if you find 90 junk articles and 10 good ones, you'll get a good idea of what's going on.
Just really, really quick before we go to questions too, I also want to say, as a journalist, we want to hear from you. What can we do better, especially at a local and regional level, to cover climate better? Also, I'm not going to point them out. There's an NPR bureau chief here in the room. We're listening. We want to know what we can do better.
Great. Okay, so we will take some questions now. If you have a question, raise your hand, and Caitlin in the back will come and give you a microphone.
This crowd is solid.
Yeah, this side.
Come on, you guys, somebody.
Step up your game over here.
Hello, everybody. I am a student here at the University of Montana, and as I'm sure everyone here is, I'm super concerned. The upcoming presidential election was brought up, and Steve, thank you for bringing up the sort of same boring narrative about things that have been going on. A lot of people, especially people who might be more conservative on the spectrum, when they think of climate change or environmental issues, they think of tree huggers and ridiculous arguments and things that they just immediately dismiss and think of as not serious issues, like we need to deal with military, blah, 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 whatever, other issues first. So what's a good way for us to break out of the narrative around climate change and environmental issues and to reach across the aisle and to bring in people who might vote for Trump this next election and get them to recognize that it's in their best interest to start working for a better future for all of us? So many of those people are those who have been suffering from low income, wage disparities, opioid crisis, all of these other factors that are related to just inequality in the system and business as usual as it's been conducted. So how do we broach that gap, come at them from their interests and their suffering and bring that back into climate change and how we can build a better future for everybody.
It seems like you kind of know what to do, right? Because you just said you're gonna visit with Are you thinking of like a person, or are you thinking of a community, or?
Well, a narrative.
Yeah.
So,
I mean,
how do we reframe the story so that it resonates with them?
Right. I think you would go back to maybe what we were talking about at the beginning, and what you also said is, you're looking at that person from where they are and what their values are and what they're concerns with, and start there. And believe it or not, there is a climate sort of impact to all of those things. And I mean, some of the most obvious, maybe this repetitive here, but it is, bringing it to health is a way that you can kind of frame the issue. And I think the way to do it is, if you know where you're going to go with that conversation, because you think, maybe you have some idea, maybe you've talked to this person before, it's an ongoing conversation. You can go back and you can do the research that helps people understand, and you can help them see that they're actually kind of in a minority, that they don't believe that they're, because they want health, and you actually can do all these kinds of statistics. 85% of people across the country believe in clean energy. You can bring some of those like popular ideas and even those numbers to your story when you go back to talk to them, and help them see that it's not a minority opinion and minority position to not care. I'm doing too many negatives here, but to care about climate change is popular even amongst their people and what they care about. You just might have to be careful exactly what you call it. Is it a climate emergency, a climate crisis, or is it, clean air, and some of those kind of pieces? But a lot of those people, their positions are actually of a majority, and they don't realize it. And a little bit of research on your end could help them feel that, and then they don't feel like it's so wrong to be able to vote for somebody or support somebody that shares their values. Sorry if that was a little jumbled. I'm getting late here. Anybody else?
I'll go a little here to build on that. I think also talking about, I think so much of when people from that perspective think about climate change, they also think about climate change in terms of scarcity, or think about it in terms of I have to sacrifice, or, I'm going to lose a job or whatever. And I think there are legitimate questions there. Like, there are questions about capitalism and economic growth that go along with climate change, but also framing this conversation to something that isn't, climate activism or whatever you want to call it, or, sustainable living or whatever, versus these other things, that it can be integrated into a life, and that, it can be a job creator, it can be a livelihood creator, and not just something that trades off with the rest of your existence.
Yeah, there's no single frame, which is the unfortunate truth of rhetoric, but it keeps me in a job, because if somebody had the secret decoder, I tell my students, if somebody had the secret, have I tried this one out in class yet? If somebody had the secret decoder ring of persuasion, right, that would be really bad for democracy, right? I mean, we've seen countries where someone seems to possess the secret decoder ring of persuasion, and it ain't no good, right? It leads to bad consequences. So, I mean, all of this stuff about diversifying your frames. I mean, the health frame is good, right? But for other audiences, they're going to be different things. But I do often come back to the idea of, don't talk about climate change, talk about something else. Find those issues that are more significant, more salient, more important. So if it's the jobs frame, then that's one that you've got to run with.
This is a very simple answer, because the rest of my ideas are sort of half-formed in my head, and I don't want to push that into a microphone. But even just how you come to them, what your ask is important. So obviously, meet them where they are. Don't simplify the issue, as I keep saying. But also, there's a big difference between you are ruining us and we need you. This is something I think the youth movement has done well, kind of walking the line between those things, like acknowledging that, yes, we are ruining them, but also like the premise is that we need you, like we need your help, and that's a very different reception from them.
And the thing about thinking not so much in terms of frames, but in terms of stories, is that the powerful thing about stories is not only that they're sort of easily tangible. Anyone can tell a story. They're concrete. They have identifiable characters, all that jazz that makes us resonate with stories. If you think about it that way, then you get beyond this whole, like, how do we convince people of climate change? Like, I'm so sick of that conversation, right? So I'm kind of stopped teaching that crap in class. Instead, it's like, how do you tell a story that has an ending that has yet to be written, and that opens up a space for your audience members to see themselves as sharing something with other people so that they can act in concert together, right? I mean, that's what good histories do, right? They tell a story of a country or a place or a state or whatever, a group, and that story is still being told. And if we want to continue the same values and commitments and ideals that are central to this community, then we've got to keep acting. And to me, again, right, it's not about hope, or it's not about persuading them to accept the science of climate change, right? It's about how do we position audiences for action. So that's kind of the broader, less substantive, but more kind of philosophical way of thinking about rhetoric.
Do we have another question?
Sorry, I have the mic already. First of all, thanks for hosting this panel here in Missoula. I'm a visual journalist and environmental artist. I do a lot of large-scale architectural projection mapping as my communication medium. I also travel and cover a lot of things like the Global Climate Summit in San Francisco. Next month, I'm heading to the C40 Summit in Copenhagen. And I'm doing a big project coming up in November in Oslo on the Arctic. And one question that I have is that when you have something as blatant as the Arctic is on fire, you have visuals of Arctic ice melting, you have scientific data about the Arctic. Every article you read about climate change, the Arctic's warming twice as fast as the rest of the world. We've been reading that for years. This data's been there. You go to these conferences, it's not just about preaching to the choir or trying to get the climate deniers to believe, but when you're in here and you have mayors talking to each other, world leaders talking to each other, the Arctic, even the word Arctic, is not on the agenda. And so how do you get people that even believe in climate change and are doing something about climate change to take real science and real data and act on that? So that is my question is, when the science is there, data is there, visualizations are there, how come even climate believers aren't putting that at the top of the agenda?
That's a good question.
Are you talking about political actors more often?
Exactly. Mayors, world leaders, all of these people that are at these global climate action summit, how could you have a conversation about global climate action and not include the Arctic?
I mean, we should include the Arctic. Yeah, I mean, we had a whole season about the Arctic, and so I fundamentally am with you and think we should be talking about the Arctic, and I think a lot of people are talking about the Arctic. And I can't comment on those particular conferences, but I think the Arctic is on a lot of people's minds, and a lot of big-ass conferences and meetings and gatherings and science when it comes to the Arctic. So I think these are things folks are talking about, and what we tried to do, similar to what Steve suggests, and address this through story. It sounds like you're trying to do a similar thing, and I think that's a great place to begin to address it from. But without knowing more specifics, I can't answer about these particular events. Tell compelling stories.
And you have visualizations, data, science. What about the people, right?
Yes.
So that's an easy thing for me to say, but that's the other missing piece, right? Is to get the faces of people there who can do it. The other angle, which is kind of dodging your question, is, I think that, this is a fundamental social movement kind of question, I think, is where and to whom do you apply pressure? So are those forums the best one to address Arctic issues? Are there other forums that are kind of down the scale or down the food chain where your contributions may have greater influence, greater impact? So again, that doesn't solve original problem that you're facing, but it may complicate or enrich your thinking about, okay, maybe we need to really be targeting these people rather than those people, because these people are the decision makers that can actually move the ball forward on the issue, and these other jokers over here, like, they're not going to get it. So we're gonna think strategically about audience.
Thanks. One question we haven't talked about much is the refugee situation, whether it's climate refugees or political refugees. It's a big story. And to hear the right-wing side of this, it's all about building a wall. But for the people in El Salvador, it's not about that. It's trying to survive and under conditions of drought, etc. And we have the same thing going on in the Middle East. And I think that this is an opportunity for people, journalists especially, to be playing up this issue, because it does involve Defense Department. They've been saying this for years, but why doesn't that get out there more? Every once in a while it does, but I'm hoping you can include that, everybody can. And please remember that we've had some successes. The coal terminals is one of them. And that's because of the people, like the people in this room, got up and did something.
I guess that's in part an answer to your question before, is if these are political actors, where are they getting their agenda? So if the people who voted them into office, assuming they're electoral, that's who has the power in that situation, because for some reason they feel politically that they have a pass on Arctic issues. The refugee thing is one of my favorite topics, not because I like creating refugee situations or climate change, but it's one of those few areas where we don't have a lot of tactics other than the scare tactics right now, because it hasn't happened. At least it hasn't happened on the scale that it's going to happen. We see a lot of this happening in the Middle East, like Syria was definitely exacerbated by drought that was exacerbated by climate change. We see it in the Pacific, where New Zealand just denied citizenship or visas or something to Pacific Islanders that are being drowned out of their islands. But it's an interesting issue, especially in Montana, where we had so much trouble trying to get refugee resettlement started here 3 years ago. And if it was that hard to resettle people who were literally fleeing bombings and genocide and things in Syria and the Congo and Eritrea and Iraq, how are we going to do when we have literally millions showing up at the border of Montana from Florida and Louisiana and the Midwest, and not to mention other countries? Where are our morals going to stand up or break down when we're dealing with refugees within our own borders, or maybe even us? I don't have an answer to that. It's just, I love that topic, and I'm glad you brought it up.
I guess I have the mic. So I'm Cindy, and I'm a retired social work faculty member here. And I've been thinking about something that I think we could do better. And you asked about maybe some suggestions, maybe for journalism, but this is probably for all of us. And I think out of exasperation, maybe, both sides have developed terms for each other that I think are counterproductive in some ways. So there might be a room across campus somewhere, people who we would be calling climate deniers would be talking about us as, alarmists or something like that. And neither one is very productive in terms of getting the other on board. I think you react emotionally to those things rather than listen, and you shut down. And so the denier, I've talked to a lot of people. I've tried to see, what is their feeling about this. And they feel very judged and as if they're ignorant and just have to be educated, and if they would only listen, that kind of thing. And that may be true, and that may be how you feel, but if you want to enlist people, or if we do, I think the denier thing maybe needs to be rethought. Maybe skeptic, people would say that, something like that. And I'm willing to give it a try because I think it might work a little. There's some people that will never budge, and that's the way that is. But for those who might be somewhat closer, then what do you think?
I mean,
wanna
I know
stick
some
to it?
people, well, I know some people have really used the climate deniers for those people that are, know fully well everything there is to know about climate change, but they are, their money and their position of power requires them to be a climate denier. Those people, we need to call out, we need to do everything we can because they have a lot of power. I mean, we're talking about the heads of some oil and gas companies in place and, various big industries and the politicians for whom they, are very closely tied. I think the climate, though, that's who I refer to as climate deniers, and I think we have to call them out. There are other people who maybe don't believe in climate. It just all depends on your relationship with them, how that you can pull them along. We don't actually need all of them to believe in climate. We just need to get a majority of people to make some of these decisions. And people change. I mean, that is the beautiful thing about people. You start here, and you can move them, and you can in whatever creative way. I mean, I'm really glad the Arctic person in the back brought up the fact that it's more than just words and more than just newspapers and podcasts. We're talking about art, and we're talking about visuals, and there are ways to help bring people around. But I think we just need to make a distinction. The people who are not sort of involved in this, and we can talk to them about it, and the people that are actually morally, they're deciding our future in ways that are fundamentally moral. And those people, we need to figure out how to get around that. I don't know.
Did anybody else
Where
want to
that
add
leads.
anything to that?
I had kind of a pet peeve to bring up. It's not a diatribe, it's just a pet peeve. But, sorry, Steve. That's why he's the director and I'm the coordinator. I think how we parse those people out, how we decide who's a denier, who isn't, is how we ask that question, do you believe in climate change?
Yeah.
And I always reframe the question, do you understand climate change? Because if you ask about belief, it gives them a pass to make it a faith issue. I know a lot of people still use that for other reasons, and so Amy, I don't mean to push back on your verbiage, but maybe that's something, I don't know if you have an answer to that, about like whether you ask, do you believe in climate change or do you understand climate change? Because that's how I would parse out who's a climate denier and who just sort of doesn't really know what's going on yet.
Well,
Go ahead. No, I was just going to say, I think we have time for one more question.
Well, I have kind of a follow-up, on the question of, maybe belief or denial. I'm a former comm graduate student here, so I'll get commie for a second. But there's a pretty good mounting pile of social science evidence showing that a lack of belief or denial of climate change is usually not related to scientific understanding, that people can tell the narrative. People who are interested in taking action on climate change are, when controlling for education at least, just as capable of telling the narrative of what's happening. They see a lot in health outcomes, similar cases where it's not so much an information deficit, which is an approach that's often been taken over the years in terms of communicating about these issues. I oftentimes think it's, to some degree, a crisis or a lack of respect for expertise, or maybe the models of which experts are using to communicate this information. But there's been a lot of discussion of, the importance of storytelling or narratives, but what can we do you think, to cultivate in our audiences, more interest in, or make that understanding more impactful? If it's not a problem of knowledge, how can we work around that to try and create action?
I mean, I think there's something we've been talking about the whole time: respect for each other, and not reading your audience, respect for each other, not just trying to persuade from the get-go.
Any other thoughts?
I was just sorry. I'm just diatribe and a broken record. I always come back to what are you trying to get them to understand? Like I still just sort of wrestle with the idea, in part because of the evidence you're mentioning, is that this is fundamentally a scientific question that has to be addressed through scientific means and scientific information and better framing and translation of science. Let's move on, right? I mean, this is the whole. I mean, I do have a rant, which I'm going to try and hold back. But we need to move beyond that debate, and I think we have rather successfully. Now the questions are different. The questions are not about the science. They're still important scientific questions, but those are not the fundamental issues. And if there's anything that Greta is doing and that the climate strike is trying to accomplish, it's trying to move us beyond that debate to start saying, we need to start taking action. We need to start figuring out what are the actions that we can do. So, if there's an understanding, maybe it's not about climate change. Maybe it's about campaign finance reform. Maybe it's about changing our electoral process. Maybe, who knows? I mean, the range of possibilities goes beyond climate science. And so the more that we can tell different kinds of stories and open up other kinds of conversations around climate, the better.
Okay, well, I think that we're going to wrap that up for now. I'm sure if you have other questions, they'll maybe stick around for a few minutes. Maybe you can grab them before they walk out the door. But we're going to formally go ahead and wrap it up for now. But we would love to hear from you. If you have your program, you also have a little card that gives you information about the ways that you can reach out to us on social media. We would love to hear what you found most enlightening or interesting about tonight's conversation. So use the social media options that you have to let us know what you got out of tonight's conversation. That would be great for us. For instance, I'm a qualitative researcher by nature, so having conversations about the impact of storytelling is really interesting to me and something that I like to see how that impacts people and changes behavior, because so much of what we hear about behavior change is a quantitative outcome, and storytelling can be really important. And so I appreciate that part of that conversation. And then the last thing I want to do is I want to first thank the panelists. Thank you so much for being here tonight. We really appreciate that. And then also I want to say thank you to the Department of Communication Studies here, as well as the Climate Studies program. I appreciate you co-hosting us and all the work that you did to bring this to fruition tonight. So thank you. Appreciate it. Thanks. Thank you all for being here.